All right, y'all. I am going to show you an example of how to do the phase shift graph. It's not that bad, so we're just going to build on what we already know, and hopefully this will make some sense. I'll try my best to explain it to you, okay? So I've got an equation right here, sine of x minus pi. When you see those parentheses, it means you're going to have a phase shift. We haven't graphed one of these by hand before, but you have seen them when you were looking at graphs trying to derive an equation. So what we want to do is we want to identify A, B, C, and D from your equation first. Now, A comes from right here. So A is 1 on this one. And then B comes from your value that's in front of X. And then C is actually everything else, sign included, of what's left over in there. This equation's not going to have a D value because there's nothing added or subtracted to it on the outside of the parentheses. So that means that your midline is 0. So y equals 0 for that part. Okay, so your amplitude is A, so that's 1. And then we're going to go ahead and do the period. Now remember, it's determined by using this formula. So 2 pi divided by b, we figured out b was 1. So your period is still 2 pi. That's easy enough. All right, so phase shift. Here's where we're going to try something new. So the formula says you do the opposite of c over b. That's what that negative means. So the opposite of c is, well, it was a negative pi, but now it's going to be a positive pi. Okay, so it's a negative, negative, that makes a positive. Y'all know that. And then divide that by b, so that makes our phase shift pi. So now the phase shift is your horizontal movement. It tells you if it's going left or right. And since we ended up with a positive pi, that means that everything, the entire graph, is shifting to the right. So the sign on your phase shift tells you direction. All right, so let's draw the graph. And then we're going to try to figure out what our labels need to be. Now, normally when we draw one of these, we've been doing different things. Since our period's not changing, I'm not really worried too much about this one, but when you are changing the phase shift, this point right here tells you where the cycle is actually going to start. So this is your starting point. So what I want to do, since it says it moves to the right pi, I want to put a point to the right of the y-axis and make that be my pi. Now, if you want to, you could go ahead and label this first point pi over 2. Doesn't matter. But here's where we're going to start. It's right here at pi. And then we're going to end where? That's the question. So what you can do is you can take your starting point, which was pi. You can add to it. So this is starting point. You can add to it the period value. Now it's 2 pi. So that's the period value, because that's really telling you the horizontal distance in terms of pi. It's like on a number line, if you're going 1 to 5, and how am I going to get there? Well, I got to figure out what I got to add to 1 to get to 5. So it's that kind of thing. So we're going to add those together and get 3 pi. Okay. So this is my ending tick mark. That's what the label should be. So it's depending on what you want to do here. I know for sure I've got to have a 2 pi in between there before I get to 3 pi. So this is where I'm going to start. This is where I'm going to stop. And halfway in between there's 2 pi. If you wanted to label these points, you could. So halfway between 1 and 2 would be 1.5. That's 3 pi over 2. And halfway between 2 and 3 is 2.5. But that's 5 pi over 2 as an improper fraction. All right, so we're ready to start graphing this. And remember, sine starts on the midline. And we did not do any midline changes or even an amplitude change. So we're still looking at the midline as being this right here. And again, we're going to start at pi because that's the phase shift. So sine starts on the midline. So that means the first point of the sine curve is at pi. So here we go. That's the first point. We're going to graph 5 points. That's the first one. The second one is going to be my highest point for sine. Since my amplitude is 1, I'm okay just to go ahead now to this next tick mark and make it the highest point, which is 1. All right, so now my next one's going to be halfway in between my start and my end. That's 2 pi, and it's on the midline. And then my lowest point is going to line up with 5 pi over 2, and I'm going to end up back at 3 pi to finish that out. Okay, so if you look at this curve, it's got a phase shift of positive pi, starts at pi, and it has a period of 2 pi, because you could say, well, 3 pi minus pi is 2 pi. That's how far it is, and that's how that one would work. Okay, so that's phase shift with a sine curve, and the only thing that changes is the phase shift. So let's see if we can do one. It's going to have more than one change.